Welcome back. In this video, we are going to implement the update. Alright, so let's get started. So first and first, for the update, when we click on this button, we want to render a form to update. But before that, let's look at the implementation of the update API. All what we need is to provide the ID of the expenses that you want to update, and then the payload you want to update with. Alright, so first thing, let's go ahead and render a component when we click on this button. So I've already provided the component for the update. So if you go to client SRC template and the component, I have named it as what? Edit content. So for this edit content, it's going to be used to update both the expenses and income, right? So to make it easier, we're going to render a form for each, for the expenses and the income. Better still, we can use this single component for update, but to make our life easier, I'm going to create each form for that. So after you've gone through this application, you can refactor this to suit your need. So let me copy this one, and then let's go to expenses, and then let me paste in the edit content. Alright, so I have already brought, so name it as what? Edit expense. So I've renamed mine as that over here. So just rename it, right? So let me move this one. So I've already renamed that as edit expense. Cool. So let's render this component. Okay, so because you want to render this component, so let's go to the app, and then here, edit expense, like that. Okay, I have it like that. So here, let's copy one of this route. Any of this route gonna be okay, and then this route need to be protected. So here, the endpoint gonna be expense. Let me call this one edit expense, and because this one gonna be some dynamic ID to provide it, let's provide some dynamic ID here so that this represents the ID of the expense I want to update, right? And you can get this ID from the params in the component that it gets rendered. So let's render the edit expense component. So let's go ahead and then render this component and see if it's working. So here, let's place the endpoint here and some ID, any ID here gonna be okay. Okay, so you can see that we have it edit and as that. So how can we get this ID? So this ID represents the ID of the expense. So to make it more dynamic, let's go to the expenses list. So when we click on this button, we want to render that component. So where do we have it? Remember, we have it on the expenses content details, right? So under components and content details, and the button lies here. This button, SVG button here, all of this one represent that SVG, right? This button. So on that, we need to add some click function. And as you can see, I've already provided some function here. So let's remove that for now, or let's leave it for now. We come back to it. So how can we get history.push? The problem is that this component is not being rendered by React Router DOM, right? So now that's a caveat now. So how can we have access to history.push so that we can click on this one and then we can move to other page? So we can use link, right, from React Router DOM. When we click on that, it will move that. But as you can see here, we are going to create a utility function called navigate, and this function we're going to use it across the page, right? So you need to provide a way we can have access to history and all the routing methods. So because of that, we need to import use history from React Router DOM, right? So we call this one use history. So this use history is going to make our life easier, right? So if you create an instance of use, so let me call this one history, now is equal to what? Use history. So now I have access to history, so I can make use of history.push. So here, let's leave this one for now. We'll come back to this, how we can create a function for navigation. So on click on this, you need to provide a function and bring in history.push. All right, so where should we push to? Remember the route is what? Expense. So / expense, edit expense, and some ID, right? So here you can get the ID from the item underscore ID, like that. This chaining, all right? So let's check it out. If we click on that, you're going to, you see, now the form has been rendered successfully. So now here comes the logic. You see, we have access to the particular expense I want to update here. So we need to fill this form automatically by the previous details. So how can we do that? We have two ways of doing it. One, we need to call another endpoint that's going to fetch a particular expense based on this ID. So if you check the Postman for expense, we need a single ID of it. If you pass in there, then we have, I have to log in first. So you see, you need to pass in an ID to get a particular the details of the expense. So I don't want to waste resources. That is, when we come here, we want to dispatch another action to fetch all this particular expense, and then we can fill up this. So the idea we're going to use is that we're going to make use of this history.push, and going to make our life easier. So one important thing about React Router DOM is that we can send some data from one component to another through this. So to be able to send, now we want to send all this particular expense to the next page of the form so that we can pre-populate that. So to do that, we need to refactor this function a little bit. So instead of this, let's copy this one. Instead of this object, function like this, we pass in an object, and here you provide a path name, right? And the path name is what I'll cut into clipboard. And next is provide what is called state, right? So if you have worked with React Native before, you can see this how they also implement it, right? So here we can add our own data, but the caveat is that don't overload this payload. Sometimes ideally you pass the ID and some small details from today's. You cannot send a huge data from here, right? Otherwise you are affecting performance. So it's for our purpose, we don't have much data here. We have the title, description, so it's okay to send. So let me call this one expense, and then I get the here from the history, like here. So I'll pass in as that item. Okay, the one we pass in as the prop. So when we hit on this, let's try again and see it to work again. So see, it works this time around. And for what we have done, we can even remove this ID, right? So let's check it out, because if you already have the ID in this, how can we access this ID? So let's go to the app, and then let's remove this ID because we are not making use of it. So let's remove that. Okay, and then let's go to the content details here, and then let's forget about this ID because we've already passed here the whole of this one. So now with this, let's try again. When I click on this, it works perfectly. So how can we get the access to the state we sent to this component? And it's all about history location, right? So under the edit expense, if we have access to props here, right? So the whole logic is that we want to pre-populate the form with the previous data. So let's console log props, and you can see that we have the data we are sending to this component. So let's refresh this and let's check the console, and there you go, we have object. And then here under location we have our path name, and we have states, and we have expenses, and all are here. Perfect. So we can destructure location, states, and expense, right? So I'm going to show you one trick, inline destruction. So here it's like this. We can destructure location, and then again destructure the state, right? Here we have this is being cleared, and here we can also destructure the expense. And that is it. Cool. So here we can console log the expense here, and let's see. Okay, it worked. Let's refresh, and now what do we see? We have the data here. Cool. So now we can pre-populate this one into this form, and then we're going to create an action to update, and that is it, right? So let's go ahead and then pre-populate the form into that. So let's come back to edit, and we can guess we need Formik, right? So let's bring in Formik, so we can make use of the one we did for the creating expense here, and we can get this one's Formik and use Formik, edit here, and then bring it here as that. And we need the validation as well. Copy that, edit, and above here place it here. Yeah, we need title, description, and amount as that. So the last thing is that let's check it out. So inside the component, let's initialize. So we need this Formik initialization here, and we also need dispatch. Okay, so all this one we need it for dispatch our action. For now we don't have any action to dispatch. So remember here, let's paste it here, and now everything remains the same. So now we want to pre-populate this form with the previous data, right? With the previous data. So here inside expense we have a title. So whatever you place in here becomes your initial state. So if you go back to the form, let me bring in use dispatch because it's yelling at us. So use dispatch. We're going to create an action for now, so don't worry about this. So let me bring it up here and my custom import below. Okay, so let's refresh. Oh, this action too, so there's no action yet, so let's remove our action. Okay, and now let's refresh. Okay, so we need to bind the form with the data, right? So the way we did to add expense here, and we need the unchange on blur, and we did this one in the previous video, so I just copy and paste. So as you can see, for the first one, let's locate the input now, line number 6 for the title. So let me place it here. Okay, and the error, let's uncomment this one. So I believe at this point you know what you are doing, just displaying the error when the user refuses to provide the data. So let's copy the whole of this one again for the description as that, and let's change the title to description as that. And then the error, let's copy this error here, and below this description input, let's provide the error, and let's change this one to description. And the last one going to be the amount. So add expense, we have the amount here, and edit expense for the amount input, place it there. For the error for amount, place it here, and let's change this one to amount, and there you go. So let's check our form, and now you see we have the default value from 8. So instead of provide this ugly data here, let's pre-fill. Remember, we have the data inside our component expense. So here gonna be expense.title. We're chaining, and we have description expense description, and we have amount dot amount. Okay, so let's check it out and see what we have. Okay, sorry, it's expense amount. Sorry, expense amount. And now you see, let's refresh here. You see, we have the individuals. So if you go back to expenses and we click any of this one, the last one, we have 2 in the details. So here, now we have it. All what we need is to dispatch our action to dispatch. And we need the ID. For the update, we need the ID, right, to be updated and you pass as a param. So I can even give this one to you as a challenge for the update action. So quickly, let's go ahead and then create our action for update. Cool. So where are we? Client, SRC, sorry, redux slices, expense slices, and expense slice like that. So let's copy one of these. So let's copy for the for creating. So let's copy that and change the endpoint. So come below here and paste it here. So let's change this one to update expense action, and here let's change this one to update our action type. And here we need both the ID and the payload, and it can be found here. And the endpoint, and better still, you need to get a token before we can update. And the endpoint here is not post, but instead is put, right? So here we have, let's check, API, expenses, and the ID. So we have here expense and the ID. So the ID can be found as a payload from, we will send as part of the payload. So payload dot ID, the ID of the post of the expense. And I want to send the body I want to update with. If you check this one, you see I sent some data here. That's a payload. Okay, the payload for the update as this one. So the same thing I pass as a second argument to this, and we pass in our header, that is a token. So if everything goes on well, we are good to go. We are done with that. So the step goes like this. For this one, this API requires some ID. We pass it here, and then the things you want to update with. So this one object contains the ID of the expense and the actual body, the title, and description too as that. And we pass in as config. So let's refresh the application and see if you're on track. Cool. So next, to make sure that it works, let's dispatch this action before we handle the reduces slice. Okay, let's handle it quickly. Okay, so for the fetch all, let's copy the whole of this one again, because we want to handle all the 3 states. So let me name this one and change to update. And let's change the action, multi-select, and say update action, right? And here loading true, loading false. Here is expense updated. Okay, and that's all what I need, loading and everything. Cool. So now moment of truth. So let's call this update expense inside the edit update component. So let's come back to pages, expense, edit expense, and I already have my dispatch here. So let me bring in the action, and the action has been imported automatically as that. So where can I call this action? Inside the values here, this on submit, right, as that. So you call the dispatch, okay, and then we pass in our update expense action. And remember, we need the ID, but these values, there is no ID that we want to send. So we need to rebuild our data again, so that, because this payload requires an ID, remember here, but what we are sending, it has no ID. So we can rebuild the object here. So const data is equal to my object, right? So I'll spread all the values here, and then I'll add my own ID, and the ID is found from this expenses.id, right? So expense underscore ID, that's mongoose, and that is it. So let's pass this data to this action, and that is it. So moment of truth, let's try. But lastly, on submit, we need to add the on submit handler. So on submit, we see we have it here, formik.handleSubmit. Okay, so I said we did this one extensively in the previous video. So let's try. Let's go to expense again, the last one, the first one. Let's change this one to salary 3 and 3, and change this one to 3 and update. Let's check our def extension to update for field. There we go. Expenses updated. You see, we have income 3, expense 3, and amount 3. So it's working. So if you go to expenses list, you see that it has been updated to this. So let's also try to display loading or error if there's one, right? So what we're gonna do is so quickly let's retrieve. So we need use selector from here. Use selector from here. Use selector from here. So we can come here and say get data from store, and use selector. As you can see, we've done it so many times. So I have this IntelliSense. So here, let's check the store. We have expenses and expense updated, right? So we can get here expense, and then let's call this one to expense. It doesn't matter about the naming. So here we can quickly destructure the expense, and you want to destructure the loading and server error and app error. So here we have app error if there is one, server error if there is one, and we have expense updated, and we have loading. Okay, so when it's loading, we want to display the disable button and say loading. So let's bring in the disable button here. Okay, let's try and go back to the component, disable button here again, edit, and then let me bring in the disable button here. Okay, so for the button here, if it's loading here, if it's loading, let's display the disable one, right? So if it's loading, when you create it and it's loading, let's display the disable button. Otherwise, let's display the button itself and say change this one to update. Check it out. Well, it has been defined. Okay, so let's rename this one. This one has been already defined here as here. So let's rename. So let me call this one expenses data. Doesn't matter. Okay, and let's bring this one here. Okay, so let's refresh it, and if you have a slow network, okay, expense data cannot destructure app error, expense data here, expense app error. So I don't know if, let's check the expenses slices, update, scroll down for the update. Yeah, you have app error. Okay, so what is the problem? Cannot destructure app error of expense data as it's undefined. Line number 43. Okay, the problem is from here. Okay, so let's quickly console log for now. Let's comment this one, and then let's console.log the expense data. Expense data here. So for the loading, so let's uncomment this one for now, the loading part. So let me call this one true for now. Okay, I want to try if it's working. Okay, so let me check my console. Not this one. Oh, so it means that we are not destructuring it well. That is why we are getting that. So for the line number 43 here, is expenses or expense? Let me check again. Oh, expenses. Sorry. So here is expenses. So let me bring it back. Okay, cool. So let me bring it back to loading again. Where? Loading. Okay, so it will work. Cool. We have it. So if you click on app, you see the loading being disabled. So here, when there's some error, we won't display it above the image, right? So like I said, we're going to provide a component for displaying the error for now. So where's the image? Image is this one. So let's locate. So let's write something here, anything here, and see where it will appear. Here, no, we won't display it in the form itself. So let's remove this comment here. I don't need it. Okay, let's remove these ones, these comments. Okay, so this one you don't need it, and you can see, oh, display error is here. So here you can display the error here. So let's write something here and see where it will appear. Yeah, so we cannot display the error over there. So quickly, let's do it. If there is app error or server error, okay, then let's display the error. So we're going to provide an error component. For now, let's leave it as this. Otherwise, let's display it now. Okay, so there we go. So if you try to log out and then try to log in, great, we have an error. Okay, so what has left is what? Redirecting. So like I said, I'm going to create a component for redirecting.